All right, so today we're diving into some pretty deep philosophical waters.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to be tackling the philosophy of legal punishment.
Okay.
And that means, like, why societies punish,
Right.
how they try to justify it, and all the kind of moral dilemmas that
Yes.
come along with it.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
It really is. Even just defining punishment,
Mm-hmm.
it's a lot more complex than you might think at first glance.
Yeah.
It's not just about, like, causing pain to somebody.
Right.
It's really about a very particular kind of burden
Okay.
that's imposed to express disapproval for something.
Right.
And that right there raises a whole bunch of really tricky ethical questions.
Yeah, it is interesting because it's almost like society is trying to send a message
Yeah.
with each punishment. But then,
Sure.
you know what happens when that message is like a prison sentence?
Yeah.
Like, does that really work? Or are there all these other unintended consequences?
Yeah, you've hit on it right there. And the excerpts that you've pulled from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on legal punishment, this is a great starting point.
Okay.
Because they lay out all the core debates in this field.
Yeah, okay.
And so we're going to be your guides through the key arguments
I like that.
and concepts.
That's good because it's a very dense read.
Sure.
I will admit that up front.
Yeah.
So I appreciate
It can be tough to wade through.
having a guide to help us with this.
Absolutely.
I'm already feeling like my brain's getting a workout.
Yeah.
Just thinking about all this.
Well, good. That's what we're here for, to make you think.
Yeah, let's untangle this whole concept of punishment.
Let's untangle it.
Yeah.
So we're talking about not just inflicting pain
Right.
or harm, right? It's got to be intentional.
Yes.
It's the imposition of a burden, and it's for some alleged crime by an authority that claims the right to do so.
Okay.
So right away, we're talking about authority.
We're talking about legitimacy.
Right.
We're talking about the very nature of what counts as a crime.
Wow. Yeah, there is
There's a lot.
a lot to unpack there.
There's a lot to unpack. So that leads us right into
Okay.
the major sort of philosophical camps when it comes to justifying punishment.
Okay.
So first off, we got the consequentialists.
Okay. Consequentialism. I think I'm familiar with the basics. It's
Yeah,
all about
nice.
judging actions by their outcomes.
Yeah.
Right. The ends justify the means kind of thing.
As long as the results
So as long as it's good.
are positive.
Yeah.
You get it? So when you apply this to punishment,
Okay.
consequentialists are really focused on deterring future crime,
Right.
incapacitating dangerous individuals so they can't hurt anyone,
Uh-huh.
rehabilitating offenders.
Okay.
It's all about asking, what good does punishment actually do?
I see. But this is where I feel like things get a little morally questionable, right?
Yeah, sure.
Like, what if you could punish an innocent person?
And that somehow magically led to a huge decrease in crime.
This is...
Like, would a consequentialist actually argue that's okay?
That's one of the biggest criticisms of purely consequentialist views.
Yeah.
It seems like you're prioritizing
Right.
the overall good at the expense of individual justice.
Yeah.
So could you punish someone who's actually totally innocent
Right.
if it led to some greater good?
Yeah.
That's a really tough pill to swallow for a lot of people.
I'm not sure I could get behind that.
Yeah.
I feel like that's missing something very fundamental
Right.
about, like, fairness
Absolutely.
and individual responsibility.
Sure.
So if consequentialism has these problems,
Yeah.
what's the alternative?
So that brings us to the other side of the coin, in a way, and that's the retributivists.
Okay.
So they're essentially saying
Okay.
punishment is inherently deserved as a response to wrongdoing,
So it doesn't matter about the consequences.
and regardless of the practical consequences.
Okay.
It's about righting a wrong. It's about balancing the scales of justice.
So it's less about what good might come from the punishment,
Exactly.
more about what the offender deserves based on what they did.
You got it.
Okay.
It's all about the past.
Okay.
The act itself, the culpability of the person who committed it.
Right.
It's about giving people their just desserts, as they say.
Okay, but then how do you actually measure that deservingness?
Right.
Like, is it about the harm that was caused? Is it about the intention behind it?
Right.
Is it some combination of factors?
These are great questions.
And then how do you ensure that it's proportional to the crime?
These are all the challenges at the heart of retributivism.
Okay.
So even within this camp, there are different arguments.
Okay.
You've got, for example, what some people call the unfair advantage view.
Okay.
And it basically says, look, criminals are benefiting from everyone else following the rules. So punishment is a way to sort of level the playing field, take back that unfair advantage.
That's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah.
But I don't know, does that really get at why we think
Right.
certain actions are actually wrong?
Exactly.
Is it just about fairness in the system, or is there something deeper there?
That's the debate.
Yeah.
And then you've got other retributivists who are much more focused on the emotional aspect of it. They'd say, well, look, punishment satisfies this natural feeling of resentment or anger that we feel when someone does something wrong. It's almost like this societal need to express our moral outrage.
But again, I mean, should our emotions really be the driving force
Right.
behind like our legal systems?
Yeah.
Are they really the best way to determine
Yeah.
what's just and fair?
These are great questions.
I don't know.
Yeah, and they lead us nicely into the third major camp, which is mixed theories of punishment. These are the folks who are trying to bridge the gap between the practical focus of consequentialism and that moral focus of retributivism.
So they're like the peacemakers.
Yeah, kind of.
Trying to find some common ground.
Yeah, they want to have it both ways.
It sounds like a tricky balancing act.
It is, for sure.
Yeah.
And one of the most influential figures in this camp is H.L.A. Hart. And he was someone who really saw the value in consequentialist goals. Like, reducing crime, making society safer. But he also insisted that there had to be some non-consequentialist limits. So that things didn't, go completely off the rails.
So it's like, yeah, let's deter crime.
Right.
Let's protect society.
Yeah.
But not at the cost of like throwing innocent people in jail or being needlessly cruel.
Exactly. It's about finding a balance between being pragmatic and upholding these core principles of justice. And so within this mixed theory camp, there are all sorts of variations.
Just, each with its own take on how to combine these seemingly opposing impulses.
It's a philosophical puzzle.
It is.
Yeah, trying to fit those pieces together.
Totally.
Okay, so before we get too lost in the weeds of mixed theories, I'm really curious about this other approach you mentioned, which is the abolitionists. This is where we say, forget punishment altogether.
Yeah, essentially they're saying punishment, even in theory, is just not morally justifiable. So it's not about tweaking the current system. It's about finding totally different ways to address wrongdoing.
Okay, so if we're not punishing people, then what are we doing?
Are
we just giving everyone a free pass?
So they're not saying there shouldn't be any consequences. But they want to shift the focus away from punishment as we traditionally understand it. So they propose things like restorative justice. Where the emphasis is on repairing the harm caused by a crime.
And this happens through dialogue, mediation between the offender, the victim, and the community.
So instead of locking someone up, we're bringing everyone together. To talk it out. Try to find some healing.
Exactly.
But can that really work for serious crimes?
That's a big question. Then you have the idea of enforced restitution, which requires the offender to compensate the victim directly for the harm.
So it's less about punishment and more about making amends.
It's about trying to make things right.
In a more tangible way.
In a more concrete way,
That is a very different way of thinking about justice.
It is. It really is. And, that's what's so interesting about all these different philosophical perspectives. They force us to really question our assumptions. And consider these alternative approaches.
Absolutely.
So we've got consequentialism, we've got retributivism, we've got these mixed theories, we've even got abolitionism. But there's another crucial dimension to all of this that we need to talk about. And that's the whole issue of collateral consequences.
And this was something that was mentioned in that Stanford Encyclopedia entry. And this refers to all those burdens that can come along with a criminal conviction. Even beyond like the official sentence.
Absolutely. It's about all the ways that punishment can continue to affect people long after they've, served their time. So we're talking about things like difficulty finding housing, difficulty finding a job, the social stigma, losing the right to vote in some cases. All these barriers that make it so hard to reintegrate into society and turn your life around.
It's like this shadow punishment that just follows you around.
It's tough to escape that past.
And does that really align with the goals of like just system?
That's the question.
Right.
Because some people argue that these collateral consequences are actually undermining the very purposes of punishment.
It does seem kind of counterproductive.
Yeah.
Like if we want people to change their behavior, don't we need to give them a real chance to rebuild their lives?
Yeah. That's a powerful argument.
Yeah.
And it brings us to another major challenge.
Okay.
That's kind of lurking beneath all these theories of punishment. And that is the free will problem.
Okay, yeah. Free will.
We've been dancing around it.
Yeah.
But I think it's time to confront it head on.
All right. Bring it on.
So we're talking about, whether we actually have control over our choices or if everything is predetermined.
Right, like our genes or upbringing, some other factors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Some cosmic dice roll.
That we're not even aware of calling the shots.
Are we really the authors of our actions? Or are we just, kind of playing out a script that's already been written?
And if that's the case, does the whole concept of punishment even make sense?
That's the big question.
Right.
Can we hold people truly accountable for things that they weren't ultimately responsible for?
It's a very mind-bendy question.
It is a mind-bender.
To consider.
It is. And so, we've spent all this time exploring these different theories.
Right. Consequentialism, retributivism, even abolitionism.
Right.
But what if they're all built on this shaky foundation if we don't actually have free will?
Right? That's the existential question.
That's the question.
That philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries.
Right.
So buckle up.
All right.
Because things are about to get philosophically intense.
So we're in this free will danger zone, right?
Yeah. It's a question that really shakes the foundations of our justice systems. I mean,
if it turns out we don't really have the kind of free will we think we do.
Yeah.
Does that mean everything we've talked about with punishment just goes out the window?
It makes it incredibly problematic.
So no more prisons, no more courts, just like anarchy.
Well, hold on. It's not quite that drastic.
Right.
Even the free will skeptics.
Okay.
The folks who doubt that we have this ultimate control over our actions, they still acknowledge that we need some form of social control.
To keep people safe.
Some way to protect people from harm. But the goal of those systems really shifts.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What does that shift look like?
Well, instead of retribution, that idea of paying back a wrong with suffering, the focus becomes much more about risk management and harm reduction.
So it's less about you being bad and more about you being potentially dangerous.
It's kind of like that quarantine example we talked about.
Right.
If someone has a contagious disease, we isolate them not to punish them, but to protect public health.
Right. So we're applying that to the legal system.
Exactly.
We're identifying the people who might pose a threat and taking steps to prevent them from causing harm.
Right. But not necessarily with the intent to punish them.
More like preventative measures?
Yeah, exactly. Like imagine someone commits a crime, but it's very clear that their actions stem from a severe mental illness.
Okay.
So instead of throwing them in prison as retribution, a free will skeptic might say, no, we need intensive treatment.
Okay.
Therapy, maybe a secure environment where they can't harm others, but they also have a chance to get better.
Okay. So it's a very different approach.
That is.
To the whole thing.
For sure.
But what about that whole idea of punishment as communication?
Yeah.
How does that work if we're taking out the blame and retribution?
Well, the message shifts a little bit. It becomes less about condemning a specific individual and more about society reaffirming its values and setting these boundaries.
So even without traditional punishment, there can still be consequences. But it's less about you as a person are bad.
Right.
It's more about this behavior is not okay.
This behavior is harmful and we're not going to tolerate it.
Right.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that you as a human being are inherently bad or evil or whatever.
Interesting.
And those consequences might involve restrictions on someone's freedom, but again, not as payback.
Right.
But as a way to protect the community.
To keep everyone safe.
And potentially even to protect that individual from themselves.
That is a fascinating framework.
It is.
It really challenges all my assumptions about how justice works.
Yeah.
But I do have to ask,
sure,
if we move away from this traditional idea of punishment, does that mean we're basically saying everyone gets a free pass?
Well, accountability takes a different form.
Okay.
It becomes less about suffering and more about trying to understand the causes of harmful behavior and addressing those causes. I mean, free will skepticism doesn't mean you erase personal responsibility entirely.
Right.
It just complicates it.
It adds some nuance.
It adds a lot of nuance.
Yeah.
People can still learn, they can still grow.
Right.
And they can still be held responsible. But in a way that focuses on repair and rehabilitation.
Okay.
Rather than pure punishment.
So this deep dive has really, changed how I think about punishment.
Good.
I feel like it's way more complex, more nuanced than I ever realized.
And that's the beauty of philosophy, right? It's not about giving you easy answers.
Right.
It's about opening your mind to new perspectives.
Right.
And pushing you to think more critically about the world around you.
Well, mission accomplished. I am definitely leaving this conversation with more questions than answers.
That's a good thing.
That's a good thing. It means I'm thinking.
It means you're thinking.
More deeply about it.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And for our listeners out there, I think the big takeaway is that this whole question of punishment, of justice itself, it's constantly evolving.
Yeah.
There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
It's messy. It's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
What works in one context might not work in another.
Right.
And our understanding of human behavior is always changing.
So we can't just get stuck in our old ways of thinking.
Exactly. We have to keep questioning the effectiveness,
the morality of it,
and the ethical implications of our approaches.
Yes, absolutely.
And as you continue to explore this topic, I would encourage you to think about how do these different theories of punishment that we've discussed and these challenges posed by the free will problem, how do they apply to the world of artificial intelligence?
Oh, wow.
As machines become more sophisticated, more capable of making decisions that have real-world consequences. How do we hold them accountable?
That's a great question.
Can we punish a robot? Who's responsible when an AI causes harm?
Wow.
These are questions that are going to become increasingly important as we move further into this technological frontier.
That is a whole other can of philosophical worms that we will have to unpack another time.
Another deep dive.
But for now, I want to thank you for joining us.
Yes.
On this fascinating exploration of legal punishment.
It's been a pleasure.
It has been quite a journey.
It has.